In this episode, we talk about a case that could potentially set a precedent for how copyright law is applied to digital content in India. We also talk about India's advisory for Indian nationals in Tehran amid the Israel and Iran conflict. But we start by talking about the ties between India and Canada and what the latest meeting between their two leaders has led to. Hi, I'm Ichha Sharma, and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. Starting in 2023, ties between India and Canada had become especially strained after former Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau accused Indian government agents of being involved in the killing of pro-Khalistan separatist Hardeep Singh Nijjar, an allegation that New Delhi called absurd and motivated. The fallout from this also led to a downgrade in diplomatic ties between the two countries. But with new leadership in place and PM Mark Carney now at the helm, relations seem to be improving. The first sign came when India was invited to the G7 summit in Canada, and the second came when the two leaders met during the summit and decided to restore high commissioners to each other's capitals and take steps to bring some stability back to the relationship. To talk about this meeting and about the diplomatic ties, my colleague Shashank Bhargava speaks to the Indian Express's diplomatic affairs editor, Shubhajit Roy.
So Shubhajit, tell us what were some of the things that stood out to you about this meeting?
I think the fact that the two prime ministers met, firstly, Prime Minister travelled to Canada at the very last minute invitation from the Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney.
Yeah, initially there was nervousness whether India would be invited at all.
I mean, there was no invitation at the beginning till there was a phone call between Mark Carney and Prime Minister Modi. And at that, the invitation was extended and it was accepted because India has been going for these G7 outreach summit sessions since 2019, when the French President Emmanuel Macron had invited the Indian Prime Minister to Biarritz in France. So there was sort of an expectation that India would be invited. But because of the state of relationship with Canada, it hadn't come till then. And then when the invitation came and it was accepted, so that itself, I think, set the ball rolling for this meeting.
And what stood out to you in terms of what was discussed and what came out of it?
What really struck me was a couple of things. That I think there was sort of a mutual understanding of the fact that they need to be sensitive to each other's concerns. So both sides did not raise the issues of the Khalistan extremism or the transnational killing of Nijjar, whose allegations have been denied by India, in the public domain. So I think that was the first fresh start and departure from how former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau had sort of publicized the whole allegation, and then each time he would talk it up and then there were very sharp reactions from the Indian government, from MEA or the foreign minister at different levels. So I think from that perspective, the optics was both sides tried to keep it as calm and as composed as possible. And then they decided to take very calibrated steps towards repairing the relationship. So from reinstatement of ambassadors or high commissioners in this case, to resuming negotiations for a trade pact or dialogues on trade, connectivity, and people-to-people contact. So I think all these are sort of measures to repair the damage that has happened in the last few years and then to bring it back to a normal level and sort of really dealing with the complaints of each other like adults. And the two sides have been almost fighting or yelling at each other and talking at each other like a fight in a schoolyard. So I think this time it was much more an adult approach to the episode and putting it behind and moving forward for a more sort of constructive approach. That's what we saw.
And you mentioned that none of the serious issues like the Khalistani problem, they weren't discussed in public. But what sense do we get from the public statements given by these two leaders?
I think the Indian side sort of did not at all headline the Khalistan separatism or extremism. That was a very measured call by Indian side. On the Canadian side, they have talked about the transnational crimes and security, but have stopped short there. So I think both sides have indicated that they are willing to talk about these issues, but much more and behind closed doors and not in the public domain. And as we have learned and we reported also about the negotiations or talks going on between the two sides to sort of create a consultative mechanism, a joint working group sort of a thing on transnational crimes, so that they can insulate this Niger episode from the relationship, so that any new developments, say the judicial process will take place in the next few months or years, that should not impact the overall bilateral relationship, the political or the economic level. So I think that is the whole idea, to ring fence the bilateral relationship from this one episode. So one incident should not define the entire relationship.
And we've just been mentioning the Khalistan issue, but could you elaborate on that and talk about some of the concerns that India has had with the Canadian establishment, and what are the things that it wants the country to address?
I think the Indian establishment has been consistently saying that there are bad actors in Canada who have sort of been operating under the freedom of speech sort of interpretation of in Canadian constitution, Canadian legal system, but have been carrying out activities that promote Sikh separatism and extremism against India. I think that is something that has concerned India a lot, and that has been the pain point that India has sort of raised with Canada time and again. Canada, on its defense, always says that it has always asked the Indian government for evidence and proof that it can present to its judicial system, so that the judicial system can act against those people. And that, Canada says, has not been given enough evidence and proof. So it has been this cat and mouse game between the two sides, where one side feels that the other side is not doing enough, the other side feels that the Indian side is not giving it all the required information and evidence to deal with the situation. So I think that to deal with this kind of situation, you need a much more robust mechanism and sort of a confidence that the two sides, security establishments, are on the same page. I think if a consultative mechanism is formed or revitalized in whatever form, whether it's a joint working group or a joint consultating group, there are various ways one can frame it. So from the Indian side, say the NIA can be the lead. On the Canadian side, similar agencies can be their counterparts, and they can talk and discuss these issues and deal with this situation, deal with these issues in a much more cooperative manner.
And Shubhajit, during the peak of the India and Canada tensions, it was getting difficult for students to get visas, for tourists to get visas. Are those issues still there?
Yeah, so one of the things that the two prime ministers agreed was to resume dialogue on people-to-people contact, which is essentially deals with when we talk about people-to-people contact, it is about the visas. So essentially the student visas, you're right, there are a large number of students who go to Canada for higher education. They have some of the world's best universities, including McGill and others. So I think the Indian side would want a smoother visa system, visa process for Indian students, Indians who want to travel there, because there are a lot of diaspora there, Indian communities there, they can visit their families. Similarly, Canadian passport holders who are of Indian origin can easily travel to India. And obviously, there are a lot of Indians who also go there to make a living, go for jobs. And Canada is one of the few Western countries which really gives a pathway to the permanent residency and a future citizenship within 5 to 7 years. So which is like, which many Indians want to avail of those facilities. So I think the Indian side and the Canadian side will be talking about it as well, to ease that flow of and mobility of people from one country to another.
And Shubhajit, during the Canadian elections, there was a sense in India that, the tensions which began under Trudeau might carry over into the new government. But now after the recent meeting between these two leaders at the G7 summit, have those concerns been alleviated?
I think what we saw with the appointment and election of Carney, we saw a complete change in the approach by him towards dealing with the whole Niger affair. As I said earlier, Trudeau had made it public. He believed in public naming and shaming of India and the Indian government, Indian authorities, as he linked India with the Niger killing, which India denied stoutly. On the other hand, Carney actually played it very safe, is very measured. From the first word go, he kept saying that this is a judicial process. We can't comment on a judicial process. So I think we saw much more measured way of responding to these charges, these allegations, and very serious allegations against India. So that, I think, really changed the optics and brought the India-Canada relationship at a situation where at least there could be a phone call and an invitation which could be honored by an Indian Prime Minister.
And now, shifting focus from the world of diplomacy, we turn to a case that could potentially set a precedent for digital content creation and copyright law in India. This is a case involving the YouTuber Mohak Mangal and the news agency ANI, which earlier this month accused Mangal of using its exclusive content in at least 10 of his videos. And according to Mangal, this is what ANI has told him.
ANI ने मुझ पर प्रेशर डाला कि अगर मैंने 50 लाख रुपए नहीं दिए तो मेरा चैनल डिलीटेड रहेगा.
I'll just be okay.
Now, this matter is currently being heard by both a Delhi trial court and the Delhi High Court, and its proceedings could offer clarity on what actually qualifies as copyright infringement versus what can be defended as fair use, especially by content creators and even journalists. To talk more about this case, we are now joined by the Indian Express's Sohini Ghosh, who reports on the law for the paper. Sohini, we understand that ANI has filed 2 cases against this YouTube content creator, Mohak Mangal. So could you begin by telling us what lies at the center of this case?
So basically, ANI has filed 2 suits. One is for copyright and trademark infringement, which is before a trial court, Patiala House Court. And a second suit which is alleging trademark infringement, disparagement, and defamation. And this suit is before the Delhi High Court. Now, to understand the genesis of this, basically there was a report by Reporters Collective where they highlighted how ANI is apparently using this modus operandi with content creators, where they flag copyright infringement of their content by these content creators, and subsequently they raise copyright strikes, start taking legal action, and ultimately then they approach the content creators with a deal where they say that all the legal action will go away if you take up licensing with us, and the quote prices on that, etc. Now, content creators have basically termed this as an extortionist policy. So this is how the genesis begins, because soon after the news report, ANI raised copyright strikes on Mangal's channel. Whereas if we see the suits which are before the High Court or the trial court, there ANI is alleging copyright infringement of content of theirs which are as old as 2023. The one question that comes to mind is, why did ANI not raise these objections back then? Although they have explained in their suit saying that they came to know about these infringements only now. So there's that.
Right. And could you talk a bit about what kind of ANI content was used in Mangal's videos? And also in what context were they used?
So Mohak Mangal, if you see his channel, he does not claim to be a news reporter or a journalist, number one. Number two, a lot of his videos are basically, in a way, explanatory in nature. And it uses news links, news reports, etc. to substantiate whatever he's saying.
जो आप बहुत खुशी से पनीर खा रहे हो, क्या वो रियल है या फिर फेक? 20 अगस्त 2013 राजस्थान के जोधपुर में आईपीएस अजय लांबा, जो उस इलाके के डिप्टी कमिश्नर ऑफ पुलिस है, वो अपने कैबिन में है। एक लड़की ने इंडिया का एक बहुत बड़ा रिकॉर्ड तोड़ा। पूजा सिंघल केवल 21 साल और 7 दिन की उम्र में एक आईएएस ऑफिसर बन गई। हमारे देश की youngest
So in those terms, there what ANI has flagged are around 10 videos in their copyright infringement suit, which is before the trial court, claiming that parts of interviews, exclusives, etc. that ANI put their resources in and obtained were used without permission unauthorizedly by Mangal. And these include, say, for example, where the minister Rajnath Singh is telling ANI about India's nuclear first policy, or some other minister making comments about the farm laws, etc. So it's mostly interviews and news bites that Mangal had used in his videos and which ANI is taking an objection to.
And also, could you briefly explain how YouTube's copyright strike and takedown system works?
So YouTube, basically to deal with copyright infringements, it has two mechanisms in place. One is the content ID system, which is more or less an automated system. What they do there is, for example, if I upload any content on YouTube, they will run it against their database of copyrighted content and see if there's a match in terms of audio, video, etc., other parameters. And if they find a match, they basically block access to it or raise an issue over it. The second method is basically, say, where a copyright owner, for example, if I am a copyright owner and I see someone using my content, the copyright protected content, what I can do is basically submit a legal copyright removal request on YouTube's portal. And this is basically known as a takedown notice. And although while I'm submitting the takedown notice, I don't need to really justify per se, because if you see the format, it is such where I don't have to per se justify point by point or with exact legal points why I think something is infringing my copyright protected content. But it broadly gives me an option to say that this is a violation, so take this down. What YouTube then does is it reviews the request, and if it finds to be valid, it takes down the alleged copyright infringing video, which is what it terms as a copyright strike. So 3 copyright strikes for a user within 90 days can lead to the user's account along with any associated channels to be terminated, inaccessible. So basically, if you're a content creator, that is a heavy cost to pay because practically your livelihood is being stymied here.
And so this is what ANI basically did with Mangal's channel. But is there something a YouTube content creator can do in counter of these strikes?
So the recourse here is, say someone's video has been flagged as infringing on copyright. They can submit a counter claim or counter notification, basically justifying that why it is not a copyright infringement. They also have other recourses in place where they can also get a retraction, where basically the creator can get in touch with the person who claimed infringement of copyright and ask them to retract their claim. And another option is they can wait for the strikes to expire, the period for which is 90 days. Now, YouTube although has some concessions in place for channels which are part of its YouTube partner program, which is also what Mangal's channel was or is. And that what that gives you is just a window of, say, 7-day period where after 3 copyright strikes, he gets 7 days to respond to them and his channel is not removed. Although the mechanism remains the same as to what action YouTube will take, the only advantage you have as a partner program member of theirs is you get few days to breathing space to respond or whatever action you might want to take.
Right. And so, Sohini, we know that Mangal in turn has argued that his use qualifies as fair use or fair dealing under the Indian law. But can you tell us what does this mean?
So fair dealing, or we call it fair dealing in India, fair use also means the same thing, and the term is used in other international jurisdictions like say US. So what it does is, under the Copyright Act, they draw some exceptions where the law is saying that XYZ type of alleged infringement are not exactly an infringement. So for example, if I'm using some copyright protected work for research, for criticism, or for review, or for say reporting of current affairs and events, these don't really exactly qualify as copyright infringement. So in a way, it's a protection guaranteed under the act in that way. Now, what comes into play here is most copyright-related disputes or suits, they reach the court, and the court usually deals with them on a case-to-case basis, looking at various aspects. How much of the content did you use, the copyright protected? How critical was that in the entire copyright aspect? For example, if I'm using the crux of the matter, which is copyright protected, will it qualify as fair dealing or not? So this is where the Copyright Act gives a sort of a leeway, and courts have time and again held the exception of fair dealing.
Right, and Mangal also cites the de minimis principle, which basically means that minor use isn't really worth the legal scrutiny. So talk about how this is being used as a defense in this case.
So in copyright infringement cases, the alleged infringer, they have multiple defenses. One is of, for example, that of fair dealing. A second easier principle is that of the de minimis principle. So for example, if I'm putting out a video of 1 hour and I use 8 seconds of, for example, a clip of ANI or an interview of ANI. So an 8-second use in a 60-minute video, is that really copyright infringement? So in that, what Indian courts have done is they have broadly given 5 parameters on which the de minimis principle has to be tested. So for example, if I am claiming the defense of de minimis principle, the factors it will be examined on will include the size and type of the harm, and the cost of adjudication, the purpose of the violated legal obligation, and the effect on the legal rights of third parties. Third parties being, for example, if we take the ANI versus Mangal's case, the viewers of Mangal's videos. Are they getting misled that, Mangal himself interviewed the ministers? And the 5th parameter being the intent of the wrongdoer. Why are they using that 8 seconds of clip in the 60 second? Is it just a pointless use? Is it adding any comment or value to what it is extracting from the purported copyright protected content? So that comes into play. So this is one principle that his counsels had basically raised in the passing, and it's not something that has exactly been argued over yet, but it remains to be seen because both the suits are pending the broader adjudication of the contentions that ANI is raising.
But does this principle really offer any advantage to the content creator?
So one of the advantage of using the de minimis principle while arguing is, if you are able to establish it in your favor, you might get, number one, a quicker order from court, because since the parameters are fixed, you can just test it on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and see where it stands and pass an order accordingly. So it is easier, it is less time consuming to deal with, say, compared to determining fair dealing, where a lot of factors will have to be looked into.
Also, Sohini, earlier you mentioned that YouTube removed Mangal's content under the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, or the DMCA, which is a US law, and how this could be problematic. So can you tell us what does that mean for Indian content creators who are using a global platform like YouTube?
Now, an important thing here is YouTube, basically when it deals with copyright strikes, it's working under the US law of Digital Millennium Copyright Act and not the Indian law. So basically what the Digital Millennium Copyright Act does is, of course, it protects copyright infringement. But one of the provisions of it is also providing, say, your online platforms or online service providers and internet service providers, giving them a safe harbor. So basically the DMCA takedown notice system is such where, for example, if someone is raising an issue of copyright infringement and bringing this to the notice of the OSP and the ISPs, they have to take the content down. This is what the DMCA says. And this is necessary for these platforms so that they don't suffer liability for the user's content. So for example, if YouTube is not taking down any content which has been flagged as infringing on copyright, YouTube too can face action in courts. So now in India, we now do have IT intermediary rules, which too gives a similar safe harbor provision for online platforms. So what is unique about this case now, what remains to be seen, is how do we actually merge the IT intermediary rules and DMCA and the Indian copyright law to actually have a mechanism or say a system in place where just flagging of copyright infringement is not resulting in takedowns, because we have an economy right now, a content creator economy, and they can always claim their right to livelihood, because when such takedowns are affected, it's their livelihood which is being directly impacted. So it can't be a very cursorily done exercise. It has to have some parameters in place. It has to be tested in the right way for it to be fair for all parties involved. And that is something that remains to be seen, how Indian courts actually lay the jurisprudence on that.
And in the end, we talk about India's advisory for Indian nationals in Tehran. As tensions between Israel and Iran intensify, the Indian government has issued an urgent advisory asking all Indian nationals in Tehran to leave the city at the earliest possible opportunity. According to the Indian Express's diplomatic affairs editor Shubhajit, this advisory was put out by the Indian Embassy in Tehran, and it asks Indian citizens and persons of Indian origin currently in the city to move out using their own available resources. The Ministry of External Affairs has also confirmed that 110 Indian students, 90 of them from Kashmir, have already successfully moved out of Iran. These students were enrolled at the Urmia University of Medical Sciences and crossed the border in Armenia. The evacuation was coordinated by Indian Embassy and is part of a broader preparedness plan in case the situation in the region gets worse. Roy also reported that the Indian government has set up a 24/7 control room in Delhi to support these efforts. Emergency helplines have been activated in several Iranian cities, including Tehran, Bandar Abbas, and Zahedan, to help track and support Indian nationals still in the country. Now, when it comes to evacuation routes, India's options are limited. Iran shares borders with Pakistan, Turkey, and Azerbaijan. But all three are not seen as reliable partners right now, given their diplomatic positioning during Operation Sindoor. Both Turkey and Azerbaijan had aligned with Islamabad during that conflict. So instead, the focus has shifted to relatively neutral or cooperative countries like Armenia, Turkmenistan, Iraq, and Gulf nations such as Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. These are being considered for the next phases of evacuation if needed. The ministry has also begun mapping how many Indian citizens are still in the region, gathering information through embassy channels, social media, and community outreach. Meanwhile, Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, has rejected US President Donald Trump's call for unconditional surrender, saying that Iran will not bow down to coercion. In a televised speech yesterday, he warned that any US military action would cause irreparable damage. These remarks come as people continue to flee Tehran following Israeli airstrikes on the city. You were listening to 3 Things by the Indian Express. Today's show was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar and produced by Shashank Bhargava and me, Ichha Sharma. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it. Share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can also tweet us at Express Audio and write to us at podcast@indianexpress.com.